Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very first installment of the new National Climate Assessment Roundtable series. My name is Larry Perez, and I'm the Communications Coordinator for the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program. And right off the bat, I just want to let you know that this roundtable is being live captioned with the kind assistance of Fed Relay. If you'd like to take advantage of that captioning, just use the link that we're about to share in the chat box now, and that'll direct you right to that page. This roundtable series is really intended to deliver area-specific information to the units of the National Park System within each of the 10 National Climate Assessment regions. The roundtables are valuable opportunities for you to discuss and ask questions about the latest findings from the 2018 assessment, and we really encourage your active participation today. Today's roundtable will focus squarely on parks in the Northeast region of the assessment, which includes all parks in all states north of Virginia and east of Ohio. If you happen to be calling today from a park outside this area, that's okay. We still welcome your participation. Just know that subsequent installments of the series will focus on additional regions throughout the year. And a full schedule of upcoming roundtables can be found using a second link that we'll be posting in the chat box right now. As part of today's call, we're going to be hearing shortly from Mecray on findings, impacts, and actions from the 4th National Climate Assessment. We'll follow that with an open question and answer period. We'll then segue into a panel discussion featuring several invited guests from parks in the Northeast region, and follow that again with a second question and answer session. And we aim to conclude this broadcast promptly at 2:30 Eastern Time. I will be one of two facilitators today. I would also like to introduce my colleague, Matt Hawley, will be helping us manage our technology. And speaking of the tech, just a few quick words about it before we begin. All of the functionality for your webinar is accessed through this tiny toolbar. Find that on your screen. If your flyout panels aren't already visible, you can access them by clicking on that tiny little right-handed arrow, and that'll fly out your menu panels. Be aware that your panels might minimize periodically by default, but you can set them to remain open by just clicking on View and then clicking on the Auto Hide to Control Panel options. As for your audio, the radio buttons in your audio panel show how you're currently connected to the webinar. For best quality, we highly recommend that you dial in via phone rather than using your computer audio or voice over IP. If you're currently connected via computer, you're welcome to switch over to phone audio at this time by just selecting that phone radio button. We have over 100 participants on the line with us today, or at least registrants, and hopefully they'll be joining us shortly. So all participants by default are muted to keep background noise in check. As I mentioned, though, we're going to have a couple of dedicated question and answer periods during the roundtable, and we're going to welcome you to bring your voice into the room. If you have a question you'd like to ask during those sessions, just find your raise your hand button on your toolbar. We'll be able to then unmute you one by one to go ahead and ask your questions. And just so everyone gets really familiar with where it is and how it works, I'd like to ask you all to raise your hand right now. And Matt will let me know how you guys are faring.
I'm seeing some hands coming up, Larry. We've got at least half of them are raising their hand, which tells me they can hear us, which is also very important. Looks like about 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the hands are up.
Excellent. Great. Thanks, guys. I appreciate that. And we'll remind you about that when we get to the Q&A sessions. For right now, Matt will go ahead and lower your hands for you. In addition to our dedicated question and answer periods, though, I want to be clear, we welcome you and encourage you to submit questions during any portion of this broadcast. To do so, just enter your text into the questions panel, as you see here. Matt and I will monitor for incoming questions and we'll pose them to our speakers and panelists at the very first opportunity. Additionally, if you have any difficulty with the technology today, you can use the same question panel to let Matt and I know behind the scenes. Finally, just be aware that this live session is being recorded for your future reference and sharing online. And so with that, I'd really like to kick it off and get started. At this time, I'd like to invite Kat Hawkins-Hoffman, Chief of the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program, to say a few words to kick off the roundtable. Kat, if you're on the line, take it away.
Hi, thank you. Yes, I'm on a cell phone, so I hope everybody can hear me. I'm Chief of the Climate Change Response Program for the Park Service and currently I'm sitting in a quiet corner in a retirement facility where my dad lives in North Carolina. I'm going to hustle along here. I can hear a vacuum cleaner coming, so I want to go on mute fairly soon. But first, I really wanted to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. As Larry mentioned, this is the first of 10 segments that we have corresponding with the regional areas within the National Climate Assessment. And we really wanted to organize this in a way to focus on the parks within those areas. Others can certainly participate, but we will be doing these nationwide. And we wanted to set up a way that could foster good interaction with the parks. So as Larry mentioned, we really encourage you to submit questions online. And then Larry will also help, Larry and Matt will facilitate the Q&A session later in the session. So main thing is welcome everybody. Thank you for your interest and thanks for participating. And please do take advantage of this opportunity to ask any questions that you have. And lastly, just wanted to thank our team in the Climate Change Response Program who helped to organize this. That's Larry, Patrick, Matt, and Amanda. And our panelists, Marilou, Julia, and Brian. And then lastly, thanks so much, Ellen, for you being our first presenter among the National Climate Assessment authors. So I'll turn this back over to Larry and Matt, and the vacuum cleaner is rounding the corner, so I made it right in time. All right, thanks everybody.
Excellent, thanks Kat, and thank you for your agility in escaping the vacuum cleaner. I'm very, very happy and excited to welcome Ellen Mecray as our featured speaker today. Ellen is the Federal Coordinating Lead Author for the 4th National Climate Assessment Northeast Chapter and an author on the Energy National Chapter as well. Ellen serves as NOAA's Regional Climate Services Director for the Eastern Region, wherein she really helps bring NOAA's climate information to other federal agencies as well as regional, state, and local geographies and specific sectors of importance for the Eastern Region. She recently served as acting director of the National Geophysical Data Center in Boulder, Colorado. And prior to joining NOAA, Ellen was an oceanographer with the U.S. Geophysical Data Center, or U.S. Geological Survey's Coastal and Marine Geology Program, conducting research on urban contamination of coastal sediments. Ellen lives in Falmouth, Massachusetts, with her husband, daughter, 2 golden retrievers, and a hamster. So, Ellen, we're so glad to have you with us, and whenever you are ready, go ahead and take it away.
All right, great. Well, thank you guys so much. It's a pleasure to be back in the Department of Interior working with you guys. And I have the opportunity to go first, which means I was going to take you guys through a little bit about what the National Assessment is and then get into the Northeast more specifically. Oh, now that's just, okay. Can you guys see my slides okay?
Yes, right now we're seeing it. It is in the presenter view, so you may have to click kind of on the bottom left. You can kind of switch the monitors, so then it'll become the full screen rather than just the presenter view.
That's not what I wanted. Oh, we should have done this before. I'm sorry. Okay. Let's see. It's the problem with multiple screens here. Hide presenter view. That work?
Now we're seeing, there we are, full screen, all ready to go now. Thanks so much, Ellen.
Great. All right, sorry for the delay there. Okay, so we're just going to take you through some of the results of the National Assessment and talk a little bit about the front end, about what it is, because I get to go first. So there are 10 regions you'll hear from. And hopefully you won't get a repeat of all the intro slides, but I'll get to do that. So the Global Change Research Program has 13 different federal agencies on it, all of whose meatballs, I like to say, are at the bottom of this slide. But it has to do with the fact that this was a mandate by Congress in 1990 with the Global Change Research Act. And so this is required that the assessment be done every 4 years. Which I think is my next slide. So part of the Global Change Research Act says that every 4 years we'll prepare and submit an assessment of the U.S. climate. And that has to do with incorporating findings and uncertainties with the findings, and assessing and the effects of global change on specific sectors. So these are listed in the Act. So we are responsible for making sure that we do an assessment of the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land use, transportation, and others you can read. But the essence was we've built out a number of additional sectors, but those are the required ones. Additionally, we are expected to look at trends, both human-induced and natural. And I would just say that this Act is responsible for why we were allowed to release this year on what we now call Climate Friday. It's not Black Friday anymore. The day after Thanksgiving is Climate Friday. And it was released because, it's required by law.
Hey, Ellen, if I can interrupt for just 1 second. If you could collapse your GoToWebinar panel, that orange arrow kind of near the top right of the screen. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I'm not sure exactly what part of my screen it's sharing, but apparently all of it. So in developing the national assessment, this particular time, so we've done several in the past. This is actually considered the 4th assessment, which if you do the math, yes, is not 4. It is 4 in the last several years, 19 years. So it's not quite every 4 years, but what we did is in Volume 1, we broke it up this time into Volume 1 and Volume 2. And Volume 1 was released in early November. We call it the CSSR because we acronym everything. But in essence, there are some very key advances that this report did. What we wanted to do was divide out the impact piece from the science piece, which isn't to say one isn't influenced by the other, but it was confusing in NCA4, we heard, in trying to make the distinction between the scientific advancements that we've made and the impacts that we've seen. So in Volume 1, we made some key advances in discussions on detection and attribution of change. In other words, how do we measure it and who is at fault, if we can say, but can we take individual events and attribute them to a change in climate? For example, Hurricane Matthew or Hurricane Sandy, was that climate change? That's the concept of attribution. Extreme events, things like tropical cyclones and tornadoes. We've made some advancements in terms of detection of tornadoes, but also whether or not an increasing number of tornadoes can be attributed to a changing climate. And then this picture on the cover of the CSSR is an image of the atmospheric rivers that we've now been able to document through satellite imagery, bombarding into the West Coast, coming across the Pacific, and those are that's a lot of new science there. Downscaled information, we did a lot on sea level rise in the CSSR, and we also talked about some potential surprises, kind of magnification events that are happening now as a result of a changing climate. So a lot of that is available, but I was an author on the second one, and so was Patrick, and so met as a part of building NCA Volume 2, and that was the one that was released on Climate Friday. We made this one in, mostly to be policy relevant but not prescriptive, and it does place a strong emphasis on the regional scale information. And so by strong emphasis, in NCA3, the regions had 5 pages. In NCA4, we had 20 pages. So we had a lot more room to talk about the region as a whole and some of the impacts that we're seeing at the regional scales and what that means to folks and putting it into context for what they value. So the overview of the NCA4 or Volume 2, that whole thing, is that, and we made this very clear in the language. We did not use things like very likely, kind of likely. We said the Earth's climate is now changing faster than at any point in modern civilization. These changes are the result of human activities, the evidence of which is overwhelming and continues to strengthen. So we are using the strongest language that I've seen in my 20-year career of working in climate, that we are not saying highly likely, very likely. We are saying that the evidence is clear. The impacts of climate change are already being felt across the country. In other words, it is here and now, and it's impacting Americans' physical, social, and economic well-being. Americans are responding in ways that can bolster resilience and improve livelihoods, and this is an important piece I'll show in the Northeast results. And we really wanted to acknowledge the work that our states and regions and cities have been doing to move forward in the realm of climate resilience. However, these efforts are neither, they're mitigating to a certain extent, but they are not approaching the scales that are needed to avoid significant damages. And so that's something that we want to acknowledge the work that's being done, but also, not get lazy in our approaches, shall we say. So this is a busy slide, so I want you to zoom in on the center part of it. These are a number of indicators that we use to observe change in the current environment. So this is looking in the past to now to show, for example, at the bottom, the loss of Arctic sea ice, or the increase in sea level, or looking over to the right, the increase in wildfire existence, or the changes in heating degree days and cooling degree days, such that we're having more, an increasing number of hotter days, meaning required for cooling. So that's very useful in the energy industry. Also seeing changes in snowpack and things that are around the whole country. So this is a national slide to look at the trends that we're seeing in some of these key indicators. In terms of attribution of change, this is a big part of the CSSR, the first report. To look at, so we often get questions about, well, aren't these changes essentially natural, caused by volcanoes or solar flares or the Earth's orbit in Milankovitch cycles over long time periods way before 1880? But what we're showing is that those natural variabilities that are documented in the lower part of this graph in the colored portion does not entirely account for the observed changes that we're seeing in terms of increasing temperatures. So then we look at all of the human influences and how well those are tracking with the observed record. Greenhouse gases being human-induced, or other human drivers like ozone, changes in land cover, aerosols, the addition of aerosols to the atmosphere. So some of those are also not accounting for the changes that we're seeing here. They're tracking better along the observed record. If you look at the red line as compared to the black line, you'll see that combining greenhouse gases, ozone, land cover, aerosols, and the combined human drivers track pretty well with the observed. But it's really when you combine all of these drivers, both the natural variability and the human-induced variability, that we track best with those, hills and valleys of the observed record. So I find this slide really useful, especially for those of you on the extension communications aspect of parks, to think about using this slide when you have somebody that says, well, what about solar flares or volcanoes? This is a great one to be able to say it's a combination of all of these things that we're able to document the record as closely as we are. So projected change, this is another one we did a lot of work on in terms of the temperature and precipitation trends, and I can just put them both up here. But you can see that our records are very clear that by the high scenario, which we're currently tracking on, so if you look at that lower, and the temperature graph, if you look at the lower right corner, the higher scenario is actually assuming that we make very few changes in our greenhouse gas emissions, which we're currently tracking along. And then we should, if we track along that scenario, we will be seeing changes in temperature upwards of, 7 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a big change when you're looking at 80s to 90 degree temperatures in the summer. And we know in the Northeast that we all kind of expire above 75 degrees. So without air conditioning in our infrastructure, that's a big change for us. In precipitation, the key message here is really that while we're seeing increases in precipitation, it's seasonal in terms of its variability in the Northeast, but also we don't see strong trends. The trends that we were showing in NCA4, where you guys remember that 71% increase in precipitation, the key part of understanding that message is really that these fall in seasonal, we had a lot of seasonal variability. So some of you may remember, for example, the summer of 2016 where we had a drought. It basically stopped raining in June and didn't rain again until September. So I thought we were getting wetter in our region. Well, we are in a net wet situation. If you add all of the wet periods together with the dry periods, we still end up net wet. But there are definite periods of dryness. So that's an important piece when you think about planning in the parks for increased rain and drainage, but also those periods of very dry, no precipitation at all. In sea level rise, particularly in our region, notice that along the high scenario, we can see upwards of 4 to 6 feet of sea level rise over, the next 100 years. So that's a big amount of salt water to be thinking of, and I know the Department of Interior has been doing a lot of work thinking about protecting wetlands, buying upland, and really thinking about how to preserve our natural areas that are near these coastal areas that are vulnerable to this. So it's an important feature to see that even at the low scenario, we're looking at 1 to 2 feet, even up to 3 feet in some areas. And then the high scenario even more. So this slide is really important to think about in terms of interconnectedness. This is a feature of the fourth assessment, to think about interdependencies between, the food, energy, water nexus, we call it, or the interconnectedness between transportation and water, or transportation and energy. Examples of how, the examples are listed here where it starts with a wildfire that chars the hillside, and then you get into atmospheric rivers dumping a ton of rain on a very dry landscape. That can induce a landslide, cutting off roadways and disrupting economic infrastructure. So that's the chain of connections that we're trying to draw here as we look at the impact of one area, an increase in wildfires, but the cascading impacts essentially. This is an acknowledgement slide, really. I urge you to look at the black section in the circle and think about where we were in NCA4 in 2014, that inner circle, where a lot of our audiences were becoming aware of climate, were doing assessments of their vulnerability, and some were breaking into the planning horizon. But since NCA4 in the intervening 4 years, we were seeing a real change all the way through awareness and assessment into planning, but also moving towards implementation, which is a really important piece, especially in the Northeast, and the acknowledgement of the work that you guys have done with Patrick in assessing where your parks are in terms of assessing your vulnerability, but also moving into what are we going to actually DO about it. So what are we going to do? And how are we going to do it, and where are we going to find the funding to support those activities? And then on the mitigation side, I worked a lot with parks in the Department of Transportation, was working with you guys doing some work assessing the Cape Cod Park, for example, and looking at mitigation and visitor ridership. And this is acknowledgement of the work that's being done at the state level across all of these greenhouse gas emissions, and thinking about it by state, not by park. It would be really cool to do this by park. But to look at where are you guys making your changes across greenhouse gases, increasing investments in renewables, affecting how transportation goes through the park, looking at your land use as a whole, and some of the major players in this mitigation field. You can obviously see California, but major, Rhode Island, look, above the number of activities, above 15, Rhode Island, New York, a lot of Maryland, Massachusetts, a lot in our region, Connecticut and others. So we acknowledge this within the regional chapter as well. So moving into the regions, the key distinction here with NCA4, and I think the reason why we've had a lot of play in the media and a lot of questions being asked, is that we put the framing in a risk-based manner, which I have to tell you really disrupted the climate scientists that were on our teams. It was very difficult for us to move as scientists from talking about what we're observing to what here's what we observe and here's why it's happening. Here's what we observe and here's why it's happening. To thinking first about the risk. What is it that stakeholders value? If, for example, New Englanders value access to maple syrup, because I don't know about you guys, but I cannot have any Aunt Jemima on my pancakes. It has to be real maple syrup. And so if I'm getting real maple syrup, what is the likelihood that my access to maple syrup is going to shift in the, with the changing climate? So what is it that we value about living in our regions and the access that we have to certain commodities, among other things, or access to open space, or access to the coast, or access to major historical monuments, or Rock Creek, or some of these other areas? If we value that, how are those values going to be impacted by what we're seeing in a changing climate? So it's really just, from the science perspective, spinning the impact to the front and then the observed changes to the back end of the message. We also needed to make sure that in this assessment, we were authoritative in our language. We were transparent in how it was being built through multiple public meetings. In the Northeast, ours was stacked by a huge snowstorm. So ours was done as the biggest virtual meeting I think I've ever done. There were like 350 people on the phone. It's crazy. But we did have a very comprehensive look at what it is that people value in our region. And we wanted to make sure that it was very inclusive. Not only, it wasn't just built by a bunch of government scientists in a back room, but it had academics, it had state climatologists, it had people from multiple different federal agencies, not just one or two. It had people from industry, different age groups. So it was very inclusive in terms of the construct of my team and other teams. What was also interesting was the key messages that developed were done across all the different regions, and when we compared that, it looked as though all the regions were talking about existing adaptation actions. 9 out of 10 of the regions across the country mentioned the impact to the economy and to ecosystems and health. 8 out of 10 of us talked about rural livelihoods, which is a brand new key message. In the Northeast, we really didn't want to zoom in on Hurricane Sandy. The left hook storm was something that really was highlighted in NCA4, but New York as a city has huge resources available to deal with that. And so we wanted to talk about what happens with the rural communities that don't have those resources, and how about the vulnerability there. So that was talked about a lot. As well as 7 of 10 of the regions discussed the vulnerable communities, not only rural, but also in terms of age or illness, and in terms of health. But how are they vulnerable to changes in extreme temperatures, extreme precipitation, and other pieces? So zooming in on the Northeast, my last few slides. This is the Northeast. So Larry described the Northeast for the parks, and that's north of Virginia and out to Ohio, which is pretty similar to the Northeast National Assessment region. And what we wanted to show here was the region is unique in terms of the country because of our major cities, our major economic drivers in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., and you can see those. But what we also wanted to show was the values that people hold, even if they live in the city, in terms of the interconnected highway system that allows them to access the coast and allows them to access inland rural areas for their recreation and for their well-being. So we wanted to show the interconnectedness of the Northeast. And how that interconnectedness affects rural industries was our key message number 1. Looking at the seasonality of the Northeast and the phenology, the phenological changes that we're seeing, and basically the region's sense of place is defined by our ability to go see the leaves change and to see, monuments up in the Northern Kingdom, and to look at how the livelihoods of those communities are impacted by the fact that people from New York City ski in Vermont. So how are we as Northeasterners dealing with changes that we're seeing in snowpack, our ability to access forests and wildlife, and how we can do that with changes in stream flow impacting our infrastructure. Key message 2 really has to do with our access to the coast, that both coastal communities and the oceans as an ocean resource greatly impact our tourism, impact our ability to recreate when we're not working in the cities, but they also influence our region's commerce and therefore our way of life. We do see through this figure and through our multiple data sets that we are seeing warmer temperatures in the ocean, and that is accelerating our sea level rise, and also an examination of ocean acidification as a means that threaten the services that we receive from the ocean community. The adaptive capacity of marine ecosystems and those coastal communities are going to shift, and those socioeconomic outcomes are also impacted by a changing climate. So all of these pieces are about our access to the coast and about our marine systems. But we would be remiss, given all those red areas, if we didn't focus something on the urban environment. So many of us, I like to say, may be forced to work there. Some of us are not. But in so doing, we are looking at the connectedness between these urban centers and our ability to go there to, they're national hubs for our cultural activity. There's certainly some parks like Gateway that you'll hear from that are directly connected to the New York area. And those can have, those urban areas are going to change in terms of our critical infrastructure and those economies. And this picture was taken by one of our authors who was just walking down the street in New York and noticed that they're already making, measured changes as a result of Hurricane Sandy to elevate those subway grates. People could still put their bikes there, but it can protect those subway grates from getting water, pouring through them. And then threats to human health, this was an additional key message we added, given the research that was done by another one of our authors, Greg Willenius at Brown, who was looking at emergency room visits in Rhode Island and noticing that changing climate is threatening the health of people in the Northeast because of our exposure to extreme weather, warmer temperatures, and a change in air quality. If you notice the red hook, in the middle, you'll see that there's a measured change in the emergency room visits when Northeasterners are exposed to nighttime temperatures over 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So it just gets what I call wicked hot after 75 when you don't have air conditioning. So in Massachusetts, that was a term I grew up with, and that was something that we wanted to document in this report as showing that we need to really think about our visitors outside in high heat areas. And high heat, as defined by the Weather Service, used to be 101 degrees, which is ridiculously hot for a Northeasterner. So we've actually, through a result of this research, been able to change the Weather Service's thresholds for when they do watches and warnings around high heat. So that's a new movement. And then the last key message was really that acknowledgement that I mentioned earlier, changing the way communities are responding and building out the way they think about changing climate, increasing the number of decision support tools that we have available to access the kind of information that I'm showing here, and just the foundation that we're putting in place in water systems, sectors across the country. Energy is looking at this, and so just really acknowledging the Northeast as being quite proactive. So the key takeaways really are here. I wanted you guys to have these, that our residents are exposed to a change in their quality of life, and we're vulnerable to that with a changing climate. It's already impacting the Northeast, and we're seeing those measured, those impacts measured. Rural and urban communities are facing distinct challenges, so we did a key message on both to show the distinction between the two. But that we are engaged in a variety of efforts to change the adaptive capacity for future generations. So that's all I have. But I do encourage you to write to me, and I think that Larry did ask if that was allowed, and of course, I'd love to hear from you guys, and I'm happy to take questions.
Excellent. Thanks so much. I appreciate that, Ellen. And share my screen. Excellent. And we have a few minutes before we move into our panel discussion to take a few questions from our participants today. Sort of in preparation for that, Matt's gone ahead and lowered everyone's hand in the room. And so if you'd like to voice a question, go ahead and raise your hand at this time, and we'll take questions roughly in the order that they are received. Alternatively, you do have the option to enter your questions into the questions panel. And before we kick off, Ellen, I just love the fact that so much of the work that was done by the author team was really driven by community values and community identity. You made reference to that a few times in your presentation, whether it's, what we value in terms of open space or being able to have access to the coast, or even our identity as a community that gets to enjoy these amazing fall colors. I just wonder, as far as the author team goes, did they derive that sort of information from any sort of social science, any sort of studies on beliefs and attitudes from the Northeast community, or was that just kind of intuitive? This was written by chapter authors in the Northeast for folks in the Northeast.
I think it helped that our author team came from all the states in the Northeast, so we had a good geographic distribution about what it is that people value. But it also helped that we had several public meetings around the region. So we had stations in West Virginia. I'm not sure I'm gonna get them all, but we had stations in West Virginia, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Maine, Vermont. There were 5 that where we were trying to elicit that sort of discussion from folks from the geography that we were representing. So it was very helpful to see that, people's infrastructure in the Northeast, for example, is entirely dependent on river systems. Most of our highways are built along rivers. So are they in floodplains? That was important for us to know. And we were seeing the connection, we were seeing seasonal shifts, the discussion about seasons, the discussion about cultural sites. Amanda and I have certainly been on a lot of discussions where Park Service is part of the landscape conservation cooperatives, and thinking about how to document the work that is done in parks as a piece, access to those parks as a key message, as a part of our what it is that we value. So I think that through working in this region, and a lot of the authors working in the region, and then hearing from the public in the region, but no, I don't think that we had specific social science results. That would be really cool.
But you did your homework in terms of knowing your audience there through those public forums. Great. Matt, any questions coming through on the panel?
Yeah, first this is just kind of an interesting a comment from Richard when he mentioned that when discussing alternative causes for climate change, he finds it helpful with alternative causes in quotes, mind you. I find it helpful to point out increasing ocean acidification, which cannot be caused by increased solar output or Earth's orbit, etc. So Richard just wanted to kind of share that with the group, which I thought was an interesting way to look at things. We did have a question for you, Ellen. You are welcome to answer or not answer this, however you would like, but I'm going to put it out there. There was just a curiosity among the administration, whether the different levels of the department, how they have been receiving this information. Are certain departments, better or worse from your perspective at receiving the information, or just what your experience has been with sharing this information with us, maybe in Interior or the Park Service? You are welcome to answer that, leave that untouched. That's entirely up to you.
Well, a lot of us are feds, and so we know how to answer that question now, don't we? So I worked for the Department of Interior in the U.S. Geological Survey for 10 years before moving over to NOAA for the last 15. And so I watched DOI pretty closely, and I've been a part of the discussions with, like I said, the landscape conservation cooperatives and the climate science centers, now called the Climate Adaptation Science Centers. There's been a lot of, so I would say I'm pleased that the discussion is ongoing. I've also been pleased by the level of support that NOAA has provided to me and to the other authors, both in terms of infrastructure support. I mean, there's a lot of folks in that picture that were really part of the nuts and bolts of building the metadata and the background science that, while it's not mentioned explicitly in the report because we wanted it to be really readable, the metadata is huge in the background, and you can dig deeper into every one of the key messages and the science behind each one of those key messages. All documented in a series of reports. Every bit of the reports have been published in the last 4 years. So new documented science in the background there. So I should have pointed that out. But I think that the departments as a whole have been supportive in as much as they can be, given that it's a law. So we were really lucky that it was documented into law and was not something that was just being done voluntarily.
There's one more question that, and there's some others coming in too. There's one question that I think will also be great for our panel that we're going to be having a little bit later. I wanted to throw it out to you now, Ellen, in case you had some thoughts. And then for our panelists later, keep this question in your mind as well, because I'm sure you have some comments and thoughts on this. And the question was about cultural resources. What about the impact of climate change on cultural resources? Anything from the NCA on that angle of looking at things?
Well, thanks to Amanda and the work that I've done with Amanda for years in this region, we had a specific call-out box in the Northeast region on the cultural resources for that very reason. It was like, okay, we need to make sure that we're looking at this from a breadth of sectors across the different things that folks value. And so we had some call-out boxes on certain pieces, and cultural resources was one of them. So I would encourage you guys to look at that. I should have showed that. I guess I should have just added a slide specific to what she had there.
All right. So at this point, we've got one more from Jim Shaberl. Can the national parks be featured in a greater way in upcoming reports to capitalize maybe on their public value and importance?
So I've had a lot of interest in, hey, how do I get to be part of the next one? NCA4, which is great because we didn't have that same level of interest in NCA, 3 or 4. So I'd say absolutely get involved, raise your hand, be an author. You'll be the call for authors was through a public call, request for information. So when the RFI goes out, nominate yourselves, nominate your peers to be part of the author team. At the same time, there isn't a chapter specific to parks. So, and each time we do the national assessment, there's a different balance, like I said, between the number of pages. So there are key sectors that we're required to do as part of the law that I went through. So each time we do it, the regions have a certain balance, the sectors have a certain balance, and so that will shift. So natural resources and the parks should be very much involved in the sectoral chapters related to parks. So you won't see a parks call out, but you'll see a natural resources chapter. Raise your hand and be a part. I want to be a part of that chapter. Or there's a transportation chapter, an energy chapter. I think I have the table of contents in my backup slide if you want it. But take a look at all the different tables of contents, and then you can nominate yourself to specific sectoral chapters of interest.
And I will say, too, that for this iteration of the climate assessment, particularly Volume 2, we were sort of the poster child in that we were the cover. Our Glacier National Park is the cover photo. I think it was the Howe Fire that was featured as the cover, and it would be great, absolutely, to have a little more substantive involvement and showcasing in future climate assessments. So, great question. I think we are ready to move along to our panel discussion. But Ellen, thank you very much. And Ellen will remain on the line with us to answer additional questions as they arise. At this time, I want to go ahead and welcome Ms. Amanda Babson. Amanda is the Coastal Landscape Adaptation Coordinator in the Northeast region of the NPS. And in her role, she helps parks adapt to climate change. She has a PhD in oceanography and was a technical contributor to the Northeast chapter of the NCA4. And I really want to thank Amanda for pulling double duty today. She's joining us while she's in the midst of also attending the National Adaptation Forum this week in Madison, Wisconsin. So welcome to you, Amanda. Thank you very much. And I will leave it to you to introduce our esteemed panel.
Hi, well, thank you so much, Ellen, for presenting to us on the Northeast chapter of the National Climate Assessment. Today, I want to find the opportunity for parks to find themselves in that assessment. And I think that it's at this large scale, it can be a really useful resource, but today we're going to have park people to bring it down to park level questions related to that. And for, if you look at it, so that on the left here, we have that map Ellen shows of what is the Northeast region of the National Climate Assessment, which for us includes most of our NPS Northeast region as well as the National Capital Region. And then the map on the right here shows the breadth of the National Park Service sites in that area. And you can see from that we have a whole lot of National Historic Sites, a whole lot of urban areas. And so those key messages and the content of that, of the assessment does represent us. And today for the panel, we have some folks that will represent some of those issues from our parks. But first I wanted to say, of the impacts, there's a variety that are highlighted there, not just the temperature, precipitation, sea level rise, but getting at the specifics, those risks to our values that Ellen was mentioning for the park-related ones. These are things like, as we see, more erosion and flooding, changes to vegetation and view sheds, changes in visitor patterns, impacts to things like groundwater, abrupt changes in weather, those type of things. I wanted to pull up a poll, if Matt can do that, and see if you all, what are some of the effects of climate change described in the National Climate Assessment that may be challenging for your park. So we have a number of options here. Unfortunately, we're limited, but if everybody can vote, I think you can vote for multiple ones. So we'll get a sense of some of the effects of climate change you recognize may be an issue for your park. So we'll give that a moment for you all to fill that out.
We are getting a number of responses in so far, so keep them coming. I'm going to leave it open a little bit longer still. We've got almost half of you have voted so far. Excellent.
And then there's the recognition, with these particular impacts, there's also opportunities for that adaptation, and that we'll talk about today with the panel, where as we look to adapt, within parks, we have access to partners and volunteers to work with us. There's relationships with state and local government to solve problems with the surrounding, working with surrounding communities. We have access to resources to help visitors be comfortable, working with concessionaires who might be able to improve the visitor experience. And then we're going to have to think about changes that we have to reimagine how we address some of the impacts, and think about new programming and new interpretation to interpret this change. So we really have the opportunity with parks, as we're seeing these impacts, to model some of these resilience and adaptation opportunities. Okay, we have the results now. It looks like the degradation of historic structures is common for 78% of you. That was the top one, and 3 others, or over half of you, are recognize that it will be a challenge. So thanks for your input. And now we're going to switch to, I'd like to introduce our really awesome panel. We have a variety of folks to discuss some of these issues of how these are affecting parks. So for starters, I'd like to introduce Julia Washburn, who is the superintendent of Rock Creek Park, where she supports a team of staff, partners, and volunteers who care for over 3,000 acres of forest, open space, and cultural sites in the heart of Washington, D.C. Previously, she served as the National Park Service Associate Director of Interpretation, Education, and Volunteers. She holds a master's degree in museum education from Bank Street College of Education and teaches adjunct at George Washington University. Next, we have Marilou Ehrler, who is a historic architect and the Chief of Cultural Resources at Gateway National Recreation Area. As a licensed architect with a master's in historic preservation, her experience includes adaptive reuse, restoration, preservation planning, evaluation, and assessment of materials and systems, documentation, design, and project management. During her tenure at Gateway, Marilou has represented cultural resources on Gateway's new general management plan, worked with a team to develop a method of prioritizing the park's cultural resources, and worked with the Sandy recovery team to develop resilient solutions for the repair of the park's cultural resources damaged by Hurricane Sandy. And lastly, we have Brian Goeken. Brian is the Chief of Technical Preservation Services Division of the National Park Service. TPS issues the Secretary of the Interior's standards for the treatment of historic properties, which include the standards for rehabilitation and related guidance widely used at the national, state, and local levels, and develops other historic preservation guidance and information on preserving and rehabilitating historic buildings. Prior to joining the NPS in 2011, Brian was Deputy Commissioner in Chicago's Planning and Development Department for more than 10 years and has more than 25 years of experience in historic preservation, urban planning, architecture, economic development, and urban design. So thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to start it off with questions for each of you, and then we'll work in questions from the audience, as well as some more poll questions. So I'll start with a question for Julia. On the key message from NCA4, maintaining urban areas and communities and their interconnectedness, a lot of parks in the Northeast are in urban areas where partnerships with surrounding cities are an important opportunity. How has your park worked with communities to prepare for climate change?
Well, thanks, Amanda. We're really fortunate in Washington, D.C. that we have a lot of green space and a lot of stakeholders who care about and take responsibility for that green space. At Rock Creek Park, we manage about 3,000 acres of forest, stream valley, meadows, and grassy open space. But as you can see from this photo, we're surrounded with development, a lot of development, and actually it's really on almost all sides of the park. So we're more or less an island. We know that the main ecological stressors that we're currently facing, such as stormwater and invasive species, they're only going to intensify as the climate changes. So to plan for and mitigate these stressors, we have a wide variety of important partnerships with other federal agencies, with local governments, community groups, and nonprofit organizations. And actually, as a matter of fact, a huge part of my job is interacting with all of our partners. So, for example, we work extensively with the District of Columbia, Department of Energy and Environment on multiple stormwater mitigation projects. And those include things such as stream daylighting, stream restoration, and installing low-impact stormwater management infrastructure. And in addition, we work very closely with groups such as the Rock Creek Conservancy. We're very fortunate to have a very active conservancy. And they help us with invasive plant management and stormwater mitigation, both in the park, but also in the urban communities that surround the park throughout the watershed. So we're also fortunate that at the end of the north end of the park, just at the top of the park, we're contiguous with Montgomery County, Maryland's municipal park of the same name, Rock Creek Park, and it reaches up north into Montgomery County, Maryland, towards Rock Creek's headwaters. So this is really important from the point of view of interconnectedness and habitat to our north. So we absolutely cannot take care of the park without these strong partnerships. They are critical to our capacity for climate change adaptation.
Thanks. Next, I'll ask Marilou, on the key message, adaptation to climate change is underway. Within the chapter, as Ellen mentioned, there's a page on adapting the Northeast cultural heritage, which features some of the post-Hurricane Sandy adaptation actions taken by Gateway. Can you share with us adaptation examples from Hurricane Sandy recovery?
Absolutely. Thank you, Amanda. For Gateway, to be quite honest, given the diversity of our resources, we have 9 historic districts in 2 states. We found that not one approach worked for everything. We had been in the process of prioritizing our resources. This is our Sandy Hook unit, one of our lowest layer buildings.
that's on the screen now. And actually, in this case, these used to be our maintenance facility, and we constructed a new facility after a long EIS process. But some of the things we've considered, and one of the things we did in this assessment of and prioritization, we looked at our impacts during Hurricane Sandy. At the time, we didn't have everything laid out for us. So we took climate change and looked at whether we flooded at the first floor occupied level, whether we flooded at the basements, was there wind damage, and we added this to prioritization and then began to look at what structures we would put money into and preserve, what structures we would stabilize, try to hold on to them, and then what structures which, quite honestly, we would decide to have to let go. And that was a very difficult decision. I know there are other parks dealing with the same issues now in similar ways, but quite different ways. So in terms of lessons learned and ways we adapted, what we did was we actually mapped all the first floors of our buildings, the first occupied floor of all our buildings, and looked at that against the flood levels for the FEMA new flood maps. We raised all of the mechanical systems, which is outlined in the box in this document. And that seems pretty reasonable in the interior, but when you think about doing on the exterior of, say, 110 buildings in an NHL, the impact could be quite significant. So we really began to look at it in a very creative way. In some cases, in one of our units, we had a lot of porches. So instead of building a new structure to support these, we might decide to put them on a porch. In other cases, we put them under a porch, but we changed the flooring in that porch to allow the ventilation requirements to meet it. Do you mind going to the next slide, Larry? No? Okay. So in one of the ones that we really were, this is one of our one building that we totally lost. This is what I call the pancake on the beach. Thank you. This is the one I wanted to talk about. So at Reese Beach, which is a recreational facility, it is literally right on the ocean, as you can see. And the water, we had lost some of the storefronts during Hurricane Irene, but we lost all of them during Hurricane Sandy, and everything just went right through the building. In some ways, the building was resilient anyway, because the interior floors were terrazzo, and the walls were glazed tile, so the water can wash through. But other things like the storefronts themselves were not. So what we did is we did an adaptation approach that in lieu of putting back fixed storefronts, we actually used overhead glass doors. And the design emulates the storefronts. It was an adverse effect. That was the determination, because we didn't go back exactly as we were. But it allows us to raise those storefronts during the next storm and not continually having to rebuild them and reuse them. We did the same thing with the wall that you can see on the right-hand side. That was a full brick wall. And we actually put that back with brick piers and then fencing, again, to let the water go through. And I think our most dramatic decision, one of the things we did is we did choose to remove 2 historic buildings in an NHL district. These were very low World War II structures, temporary structures, and they flooded to about 4 or 5 feet. It's not that one. That one was removed because it was a pancake, and I don't have a slide of it, unfortunately. But we did look at options. We looked at relocating them. We looked at putting them up higher to avoid the flood risk. All of those were also adverse effects. And in the end, the decision was made by the park to move forward with demolition. It was not an easy decision. It was a very difficult decision. It's taking up clearly a number of years to get here, but we have an MOA that went out for public comment. We have partners who are against this, other people who have real concerns about us demolishing these 2 historic structures in an NHL. But at this point, it looks like we are moving forward with that. And that was any other questions? Any questions?
Well, so I think right now, before I move on to a question for Brian, if we can pull up another poll, this was question 3 actually, Matt, that some adaptation options, as Marilou was mentioning, some adaptation options for historic structures raise concerns because they don't meet the Secretary's standards for the treatment of historic properties. And I wanted to find out if there are adaptation alternatives which the assessment of effect would likely or did result in a finding of adverse effect, that either if because of that you stopped considering it, or whether you implemented it despite that, or consider supporting and going forward with it if you had sufficient climate change information to help inform that decision. So if you all want to answer that poll, and that'll be a good transition to, once we see the results, I have a follow-up question for Brian.
We've got the responses trickling in right now. About a quarter of you have voted here. So if you have any thoughts on this, now's your chance. I'm going to leave it open for about another 20 to 30 seconds, and then we'll share the results with everyone, and we'll take a look. All right, 10-second warning. Last call. I know you're real stressing out about this one. Which one do I choose? Which one do I choose? Last call. Shutting it down. All right, let's take a look at these results.
So that's exciting to see, right? That if we have the right climate change information, that we're willing to work on maybe doing some things differently. So next, I have a question for Brian. That is, what guidance has your office been working on regarding climate change and the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties?
So, Amanda, we're working away, but the guidance that we've already issued on this, which was to kind of get us started, and I hope everybody's familiar with the document on the cover of this that's being shown right now. You obviously all know about the Secretary of the Interior standards and the treatment guidelines that come with that. And we did update them in 2017 and issued this new updated revised version. There were a couple different things that we were hoping to do in this. One was to, the last time the treatment guidelines had been done was in the 1990s. And what was historic then, not necessarily what is historic now. If you just think even just the going back 50 years, that now there are all sorts of mid-century and later buildings that weren't really covered as much in the earlier version of the treatment guidelines. So one of the main things was to make sure that the guidelines continue to apply to the different types of properties and resources that we're dealing with now, including property types, materials, systems, things that are not the traditional kind of things that we think of with earlier buildings. And one of the other things we did with this was there's a brand new section on natural hazards and resiliency. So this has a lot of, I would say, good starter guidance to start to try to think of about some of these issues. There is a introductory section in it which has some narrative to kind of walk through what some of our thinking is that you as folks making treatment decisions in the parks might start to think about when you're evaluating different treatment options. And then you're familiar with the recommended, not recommended kind of format of these treatment guidelines. So those exist for all of the 4 treatments for rehabilitation, restoration, reconstruction, and preservation. And it kind of takes you through some different steps on that, emphasizing planning as well as the different treatment options themselves and evaluating them. It does go without saying that, when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about how to apply this guidance in a way that's reasonable and takes into consideration economic and technical feasibility. So that's what we have out now, and that's available right now up on the web as well as in hard copy on our website. What we're working with for the future, we are working on a set of rehabilitation guidelines for adapting historic buildings to flooding specifically. And this will be similar, or at least we envision it to be similar in format to the sustainability guidelines that we released several years ago. Again, it will be under the rehabilitation treatment. And we're hoping to have a text-only version. This is a slide, actually, that one with the colored table is the slide of the recommended, not recommended from one of the pages. But we're hoping that these rehabilitation guidelines, the text-only version, will be available by the end of this year, the calendar year. We're also working after that on a preservation brief, specifically on adapting historic buildings to flooding. And then lastly, which is a really kind of neat and different project for us, is we're working on a testing project with the U.S. Army Corps in partnership with the cultural resource programs here at WASO and also the National Center, NCPTT, the National Center on Preservation Technology and Training. And it is a report on testing the resiliency of historic building materials and traditional floor and wall assemblies. And if you looked at this at all, you know that the data that's out there and what FEMA uses is all based on new modern materials and assemblies, and it doesn't look at or even consider the resiliency of materials and assemblies for historic buildings. You may know that English Heritage and other groups have done some of this, but it does not exist in the United States. So this was kind of our first attempt to look at how well historic materials perform when they're subject to flooding. I think anecdotally we have some aspects like Marilou was just mentioning with Jacob Reese and the being able to the flood waters kind of coming through, and with the ceramic tile and the brick, basically you hose it out and you let it dry out, but it's actually fairly resilient in that respect. But there's no testing on any of these materials and assemblies, and so we're expecting that report to come out later this summer, and we're kind of excited about it.
Thanks, Brian. I think now if we have some questions from the audience, can I get Matt and Larry, you to share some of those, or to for people who've raised their hands to give them a chance to ask?
Yeah, this is a great time. So just a reminder to ask questions of anyone in our group. You can use that questions box that you have in your GoToWebinar interface. You might have to expand that panel as it collapses by default. And if you want to be extra super duper brave and get extra credit, you can raise your hand and we will unmute you so you can be put on the spot and ask your question verbally. Don't get to hide behind the keyboard in that situation. So if you're willing to give that a go, you can raise your hand. Otherwise, put it into that questions box and we'll relay it to our speakers from there. No extra credit points for that, but it's still a good way to get your question out there. I wanted to go back, at the very beginning, Allie had asked about, to Ellen about cultural resources, and I kind of said, well, stay tuned, we might get a chance to get into this in our round table. I hope, Allie, we've been able to hit in on some of that now, talking about these impacts to cultural resources and historic structures. I know both Marilou and Brian went into that extensively. Julia, did you have anything to add? Cultural resources in Rock Creek, I don't know if that's something that you're seeing an impact there and is a concern in your park as well.
Oh, sure. We have cultural resources that are definitely being impacted, in particular those that sit in the 100-year flood area right down by the banks of the creek themselves. One of them is our historic Pierce Mill, which is a 19th century working grist mill, and it's flooding now on a regular basis. So dealing with water infiltration there is definitely something that we are paying close attention to and have been thinking about how to mitigate flooding. We have a cabin that was occupied by a 19th century poet, Joaquin Miller, that sits in the floodplain as well. And we are actually recommending moving it out of the floodplain and up to higher ground. So those are some of the ways that we're looking at handling some of our impacts on cultural resources.
Excellent. And as we're waiting for more questions to come in, I believe, Amanda, you've got a few more questions for our panelists. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you. The next question I have for Marilou is, one of the key messages on the NCA was changing coastal and ocean habitats, ecosystem services, and livelihoods includes impacts to tourism and recreation for coastal areas, which were a big part of the Northeast economy. What are some of the coastal issues related to resource stewardship, access, and visitor use you've encountered as part of Hurricane Sandy recovery?
So there are really two sites that come to mind, and they actually happen to be right next to each other. So at Fort Tilden, which is a former military site and a historic district, we after Hurricane Sandy, it actually removed a dune that had been there for a number of years. And the dune was protecting a road called Shore Road. It was a historic roadway. And what the dune revealed was also a bulkhead that had existed for years. And we did an assessment as to whether it was historic, and certainly it was in the period of significance constructed. And we had to decide what to do with this. This is a very popular fishing beach. We don't allow swimming at this beach, but we really had to think about what we were going to do. So the decision was made after an EA and a long-term assessment as to what our options were. We cut the bulkhead down below the soil level, below the visible level, in order to protect people that come to the beach. It's a very, very active beach. It was also began to appear in the hidden resources of New York, which actually even increased our visitorship, which was really kind of nice, but created its own issues. And then when we went back with the road, we talked about this was a really important road for people. They walked it, they rollerbladed, they used it really to access the beach. So what we did is looked at options to put it back in a more resilient way. And instead of large pieces of concrete or a very thick slab, which is what the military built, we actually put back the portion that had been severely damaged by Hurricane Sandy in consolidated seashells. So that if it did wash out again, it's, again, not exactly the same as to what we had, but it kept the path going. And it didn't accommodate all of our visitors because you probably can't rollerblade or skateboard on it, but you could bike on it, and certainly a pedestrian can still access the way. But that really did impact our visitors, and they were very active and very vocal about wanting that roadway back, and that's what we did in the end. We also had another location right next door, which was one of our beach clubs. Again, they're determined eligible as districts, but their buildings actually sit on pilings that are within the high mean tidewater line. And one was significantly damaged. It was pretty much gone. We were in the midst of talking to them about relocating further back from the water line in a more resilient location. And in the end, they wanted to rebuild where they were. It is a lease, and that's how they proceeded. Sometimes we don't all get to make the final choices as to how we proceed, but other impacts and other people have other opinions that make us go forward. So those are two areas, and they are very active beach zones.
Thanks. Before we look to another question from the audience, how about we pull up one of the other poll questions, which was question 2, looking at outside the park unit, what community partners are developing adaptation strategies?
All right, we should have that poll up on the screen for you. This one, you only have the option of one choice. You don't get to select all like you did before, so you got to make it count.
Thanks. So this is very relevant to the what Julia was speaking about earlier about working with partners and community groups, and we're curious about who some of your partners might be who are interested in working on climate adaptation.
I'm going to give it just a few more seconds here. Looks like we've got votes. Oh, they're still coming in. We've got a few more. Once I get a little pause in them, then I'm going to close it. I'll give it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I will close and share. Here we are, Amanda.
Well, that's interesting to see. We've got a lot of state and county governments that are taking the lead, which is exciting to see. And I think in the National Climate Assessment, there's some of those examples are included.
And happy to see such a small percentage for no one.
Yes, and we can improve on that in the future, hopefully. Do you want me to give the next question, Matt, or do you have one from the audience?
We do have a couple here from the audience. I'll ask one first that says, and this is just sort of a general one, so I'll let anyone kind of hop in who thinks they have some special insight. Can we utilize technology for protection of the resources and also diverting the direction of flood to the valued area districts? So just technological solutions for maybe protecting resources and from floodwaters and such.
Well, I suppose that depends on your definition of technology, but we certainly are using a lot of stormwater infrastructure technology to take care of runoff both outside the park and inside the park. So I'm not sure what type of technology you're thinking of, but the new low-impact development stormwater infrastructure is really valuable, and we're taking advantage of it.
Great. Thank you for stepping up to give that one a chance. I have a question here for Brian that was asking about, do you often hear from communities that manage historic properties under the Secretary standards regarding their concerns for how to best adapt historic structures to climate change effects?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's many historic, well, and for that matter, non-historic communities that are dealing with this right now. There have been a series of conferences under the name Keeping History Above Water, which was first held in Newport several years ago now, which was the first one. There's been several of them since. In fact, the next iteration is going to be in St. Augustine next month. And this was generated at the local community level of a historic community dealing with king tides and other kinds of problems, and wanted to try to get in front of it and try to understand what the issues were and what they might be able to do. So this is like a big part of the national conversation as part of the National Preservation Program, in which the Park Service is a part.
Excellent. Thanks for that response there. I did get a follow-up for the earlier question about utilizing technology, and it also does, I think, coincide with another question that came in, specifically was about some of the Washington, D.C. efforts. The question was, Washington, D.C. is fairly active in planning for climate change, especially sea level rise, and they were wondering if Rock Creek Park is directly involved as a part of that collaborative effort. And along with that, the follow-up to that earlier question about technology was they were specifically referencing what Europeans are doing. I don't know personally if she's referring to things in the Netherlands or things like tidal barriers on the Thames or what exactly, but maybe that was playing a role into that technology question. So Julia, I guess first, if Rock Creek Park is involved with some of those collaborative efforts for sea level rise in DC, and then if anyone does have any insider knowledge about the technology question.
Well, as I said before, we're very involved in collaborating with the district government. In particular, we work very closely with the District Department of Energy and Environment, DC Water, and the District Department of Transportation. So we're engaged and involved in working with them around issues related to climate change. With regard to the technology question again, one of the things we are working toward in DC is replacing all the Park Service's seawalls. And so that's one issue, is looking toward how do we replace those seawalls in such a way that we can actually mitigate some of the impacts of the sea level rise, tidal change coming up the Potomac River. And we do have some floodgates in certain parts of the city as well. So we are trying to use some of that technology, yes.
Excellent.
So the New York area, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is leading the effort to look at floodgates to protect New York City and all of New York Harbor. as well as the South Shore of Staten Island. And they've been sort of the lead agency looking at options, which include some floodgates in various locations.
Excellent. Hey, we are getting very close to the end of our time here, so I just want to make a quick transition, and I want everyone that's on the line here to continue the discussion if they so choose. We invite you to follow up with all the presenters and panelists that we've had today. Each one of them has really graciously agreed to go ahead and share their contact information, which we'll share with you in a follow-up email, and they're willing to follow up on any additional questions that you might have. So panelists, and Ellen, I know you're still with us. Thank you very much for taking the time today. We'd also like to extend a really sincere note of gratitude and appreciation to the many folks who have worked behind the scenes to bring you this broadcast today. And as a reminder, this team is working to organize additional roundtables for each of the remaining NCA4 regions. And again, we invite you to discuss those or join those discussions as appropriate to your area. And we'll share the link to that series in the chat box again as well. I want to leave you with a quick thought. You're going to have a quick pop-up survey here as soon as we end this broadcast, requesting your response. Please just take a moment to fill that out. Your responses really help improve all of these offerings going forward. And in the days ahead, all of you participating today can also expect to receive a follow-up email again with links to not only the recorded webinar, the contact information from our panelists, but also a few other goodies to share as well. I really want to thank you all for joining us with today's roundtable. We'll leave you with a quick reminder of your key takeaways for the Northeast chapter of the NCA4. And I want to say have a great day, and we look forward to the conversation in the year
before
ahead.
we wrap?
Yep, go ahead.
Before we wrap up, can we also, we had one more poll that I wanted to end on. If, in addition to that survey, if we can pull up, how can the NCA4 become a resource for planning within your park? I'm curious if, based on what you've learned today, or if any of you have had a chance to look at it before, what your thoughts, and again, you can select all that apply. We'll give that a minute. And I echo Larry's thanks to everyone. I really appreciated all the great discussion from the panelists, as well as the presentation from Ellen today. All right, how are we doing on the answers?
We're doing good. They're still rolling in. I am posting a link in the chat box directly to the Northeast Region chapter of the National Climate Assessment. So of the 42% so far that have said, I'm not sure, or I haven't read it, we can get, those percentages are going down already, actually. That's amazing. All right, I'm going to go ahead and click close and share. And here we are with the link in the chat box to make sure those 41% there on the bottom, if we would ask this poll question again in the future, you would have hopefully a different answer. Amanda, any thoughts on the poll results here?
Well, just that's really encouraging to hear that you can use it as background information, and that nobody said that climate change doesn't apply to your park. So, and that we can encourage people who haven't read it, that they can hopefully find some good additional information going forward. Thanks.
Indeed. Thanks, Amanda. Really appreciate it. And again, panelists, presenters, thanks so much. All of our participants, thanks for taking the time out of your day. We know your time is precious, and your participation today is really appreciated. Till the next time.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.